On behalf of all the faculty and members of Justice University, welcome to class number 1 of our 10-week course. I'm going to just ask everyone to say their name and where they're located.
Yeah, Norm Curlin from Arlington, Virginia.
Okay, and this is Dawn Brohon calling in right now from Arlington, Virginia, the same location, a different room.
Mike Graney, Arlington, Virginia.
Just a few quick logistical items that I wanted to mention before we have our first speaker. There's actually going to be two. Norm is going to give a presentation, a very quick overview from his perspective as someone who's been in this movement, and this is even starting before he knew exactly what the Kelsonian concepts are, or those of Pius XI and Father Free in terms of social justice. But just very quickly, as I think each of you know, he comes out of this civil rights background as a federal investigator, working with people like Medgar Evers and people in SNCC in Mississippi, where he went on to the war on poverty. And then in that area, he moved from the government into the Citizens Crusade Against Poverty, which was headed by UAW President Walter Reuther. And from that, he came in contact with the ideas of Louis Kelso, following which, after being one of the pioneers in getting employee stock ownership plans into law and also developing other applications, he and a number of us, primarily Father William Faree, who was a scholar in social justice from the standpoint of Pius XI's, his concepts of it, they formed the Center for Economic and Social Justice, out of which we decided we needed an organized way of presenting these ideas. And so that's where the idea of Justice University started. So Norm will give his perspective in about 15 minutes, and I will just run through some slides to make sure that we cover the foundational definitions of the just third way. We're designing the quizzes so that to emphasize mastery versus just, what is your score? So you can take the quiz over and over, the same one, until you get 100%. Okay. And we'll be discussing in the classes what those questions and answers, what the relevance is, so we can get more deeply into than just a multiple choice quiz. And at the end, we'll give the assignment for the next class, which, if you look at your agenda, you'll notice that at the bottom, it gives the reading assignment and study questions for your next class. So you'll see the pattern emerge eventually. At the end of this 10-week session, we're going to ask everyone to make a 10-minute presentation to give us an idea of how much you have internalized the principles of this paradigm and apply them to a problem, a systemic problem that you're particularly concerned with. So it's not to show that you have necessarily 20 years of knowledge and a PhD in the just third way, but really getting a good understanding of the basic principles. So I think that's, and last thing is there's on the CESJ website, that's the virtual library that you can use for resources, but there are a couple in particular, and I'll make sure you get these links, but you can find them pretty easily yourself. One is what we call the just third way paradigm on one hand, and this was just a mnemonic device to help you systematize the 5 basic components of the just third way. And the other is the comparison matrix, which compares capitalism, socialism, and communism, and the just third way, which we would describe as personalism. And in terms of the economics, we would describe it as economic personalism. There's also a glossary, which you can refer to for terminology. And I would say explore the homepage because there's a lot of tools on that. But in terms of getting a quick reference, the comparison and the glossary are really very helpful tools. We're going to open it up to Norm Kurland to give an opening context for this course, which is really to understand the principles of the just third way. So with that, I will turn it over to Norm.
Well, I'm only going to make a couple comments and try to give two words that I think are terribly important in terms of understanding a paradigm that isn't understood within academia today. And the two words like Kelso and Bucky Fuller and Father Ferree really make up the new paradigm. Property. Most people think of property as things. No. What Kelso said, it's the power over things and the right to the fruits of the things. Very simple. But I think most people need to understand that. And then also, what is money? And Kelso said it's really a yardstick of value. You know, I remember when I was a kid back in the 30s and 40s, the price of a dollar, well, it was measured in gold, $30 an ounce. And of course, eventually it became thousands of dollars, and we have inflation. Not that we're producing more, no, but the important thing is new technologies come into existence to replace what's taught. That if you go back 50 years, it's everything was labor, and yet at the same, not anything else but labor, to measure the economic system on the basis of labor. Well, that just didn't make any sense at all when we're dealing with artificial intelligence and we're dealing with robotics of various kinds. So the Kelso system in itself is a way of dealing with it. And if there's one problem, if we want to focus on where the problem is, we want to look at the economic system and compare it to the political system. In the political system, the vote is the social tool. In the economic system, it's money. And the money system today, as you can see from what's being done with the Federal Reserve, they're creating money and changing costs of money and so on. And also, there's been a centuries-wide notion that everything should be valued in the value of labor. And so labor costs have gone up to now where we have strikes going on, and thousands of people are campaigning. And yet, one person who came to understand these ideas was Walter Reuther. At that time, back in the 60s, 65, March of 65, I had been working first in health, education, and welfare, then later to the Civil Rights Commission, and then I went when the War on Poverty started. I went there. Why? Because a man named Dick Boone, a descendant of Daniel Boone, hired me. And this is all before Kelso came into my life. And the important thing is that I think if you want to understand the paradigm, if you don't start with Kelso and give him the credit for offering the new system, then we're not going to be able to communicate. And the important thing, we got important people. Each of you are people who can articulate things, but we have a challenge. Why? Because there's no political leadership behind these ideas now. No political leadership, and we have to find leaders with power, people with power, and we're trying to do that in St. Louis and now in Utah. And so it's going to be there, either place. We're going to have to find a person to run for president who will communicate, just as those in the past that we had. Well, President Reagan was a supporter when he was a governor of California, but later on he supported the Kelso ideas, and then you had George McGovern. I spent a couple hours with him, and he said if he were running for president, he would be speaking much about this paradigm. And you had uh, uh, Martin Luther King would have been the kind of person we need to be able to get people power, organized people power, even young people. It may be that we have to do what SNCC did, but they were basically socialists and communists. Like Stokely Carmichael was a communist, and he heard about Kelso, but he said, yeah, I think I've told some of you that Stokely listened. He said, "Okay, it makes sense, but you'll never sell it to others." Well, I disagree. That was before we were able to get laws through Congress, because we finally got to a leader like Russell Long, and then we had Senator Humphrey, and these are leaders back when, not now. There's no one like these people, and we have and I'm hoping that the people who are taking this class are going to see this as the real challenge of each of us, to work toward selling the new paradigm in simple terms so that we can surface a leader with power. And so that that's my thoughts right now, because I think the world is really a mess, and as I read the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post, it's a mess. There's confusion, but no clarity in terms of a new paradigm. Now, Sid Greenfield did write an article, and it was published. And it was a very good article on Kelso. But as far as I recall, that was one of the few articles. Today, no one talks about Kelso, and that's what we're going to be learning in this class. Thank you very much, Dawn.
Thank you. We're now going to back up a little bit. Norm covered some of the most essential concepts in understanding the just third way. And we have a series of slides. All right, can everyone see that? Shake your head. Okay, good. All right, so this first class is really to introduce you to the fundamental ideas that differentiate what we call the just third way from the current paradigms of what we would call either individualism as sort of the social context, which we would equate to capitalism in terms of an economic system, or in a sense, the opposite, which is socialism and communism, which we would say are the economic form of collectivism. So what is this third approach? And that's what the Just Third Way is about. And we're going to go through some of the elements which distinguish this paradigm. And in some of them, you'll say, no, it's, that sounds like capitalism or socialism. And we do have similarities with both of them. But as you'll see, the starting point for all of this paradigm is the human person, each and every human person, and looking at how you support the dignity and development of each person, and how you create a social environment that supports the full development of each and every human being. And this is really, we're taking from ideas that have been around for, thousands of years. And we also, as in Deuteronomy, this is one of the quotes we like to use a lot for CESJ is justice, justice, thou shalt pursue. And one interpretation of this is that there's an emphasis that really focus on justice and that you are going to be pursuing it. You will never find perfect justice. But this is, in a sense, a commandment that each of us continue to pursue justice. And this was reflected as well in the founding of the United States, in our Constitution. And the idea was that we come together to form a more perfect union, never a perfect union, but more to establish justice. That was the very first purpose for forming government that's mentioned in the Constitution. And Norm had mentioned Buckminster Fuller, Bucky Fuller, who was one of the great thinkers of the 20th century. He's most known for his design science concepts. There was actually an element called, it was called the fullerene, which reflected, this was discovered fairly recently, but it reflected the concepts of integrity and coherence. And just what Bucky Fuller was looking at was how do we design our systems? And he was mainly focused on physical systems, technological, energy systems, that sort of thing, to do more and more with less and less input. And he also believed firmly that we have the capability of bringing affluence to every human being on the planet. So he is thinking in universal terms, he's thinking in global terms. And so this is the challenge that CESJ has made our own, and that is to make the world work for 100% of humanity in the shortest possible time through spontaneous cooperation without ecological offense or the disadvantage of anyone. And that's a pretty tall order, but we believe it's achievable. And one of the markers, I would say, of the problem in the system and the direction that we have to move towards, and this was something that Kelso really clarified and articulated his system around this observation of the corporation as an important social tool and how it brings about the possibility of this affluence for every person, but also if it finances its growth in the wrong way, it will lead to concentrated ownership. And we'll get more into why that is so harmful. I think we all in this group feel it intuitively. But we looked at today, who owns today's corporation, and this is from 2012. It's even more concentrated, and it's really not just the top percent or even the top 1%. We're really looking at a fraction of 1% that owns and controls the bulk of the capital ownership. We're looking at corporate equity because we'll talk later about the importance of the corporation, but that's what we need to look at, not just mutual funds, but the shares in corporations. Then we want to look at how we move to a better system and outcome for every person. And that's looking into the future. Our system respects the property and the rights and the wealth of existing owners, but it's saying that everyone, every child and adult, whether you're rich or you're poor, should have equal opportunity in the future to become capital owners and to have access to the means to actually achieve that. Okay, so now we're going to go into some of the words that Norm brought up, but these will help you understand this body of ideas as a paradigm. So the first thing is, what does paradigm mean? And if you go through various dictionaries on the internet and in print, you'll see a variety of going from extremely general definitions to more specific. But the word itself was derived from a Greek verb, and I'm not even going to try and pronounce it here. And it originally means example or pattern, and it's been used, I guess the first usage was in the 15th century. So some of the, I think, most appropriate definitions in terms of understanding the just third way. The first is a framework containing the basic assumptions, ways of thinking, and methodology that are commonly accepted by members of a scientific community. And this, I believe, comes from the ideas of Thomas Kuhn, the structure of scientific revolutions, but it is a good illustration of economic paradigms or philosophical paradigms and how they can come into conflict and how you change paradigms and when they change. Another definition is a theory or group of ideas about how something should be done, made, or thought about. And so if we look at the problems with the economy, and that's underpins a lot of the problems, other problems we face, and certainly poverty. And we see that even racism, the basis for that, or the fears that people have, which are reflected in racist beliefs and also racist patterns that get built into systems such as banking and lending and education and other fields. So this is not, we're not just dealing with racism by individuals towards other individuals. We're also talking about understanding systems and how certain, destructive ideas can start being built into our laws and our major institutions. So it's important for us to be aware of what are the underpinning ideas. So, as I said before, the core of all these ideas, or the starting point of the just third way, is the person, the human person. And to define person is as that which has rights which are recognized by other persons and within the laws of society. And it's important then to understand that you have natural persons and you have artificial persons, and human beings are natural persons, and corporations, for example, are artificial persons. So it's very important to distinguish between the two. So we're really talking about the human person, which we recognize as a natural creation, presumed to be endowed with inherent human nature and dignity, endowed with inalienable rights and equal in natural rights to all other human persons. So this is going to say that, you can be the world's super genius and someone with an IQ of 50, but we all have the same inherent human nature and capacity to develop. That's whether that actually happens in reality is another matter, but we presume this is all inherent in being a human being. And human dignity is something which is also assumed to be something that every human being shares with other human beings. And then we have the notion of inalienable rights, saying no other person or society can take away certain rights, and that these fundamental rights, these fundamental human rights, every human person is equally entitled to them and to have those rights respected. Now, one important concept that we're looking at here is the notion of power, which is, as we know, a two-edged sword. It's something that when it becomes concentrated, becomes extremely destructive. And it also leads to corruption of human beings and corruption of systems. So power is something, it's a very dangerous thing, but it's also an essential thing. And this is the balance that we try and strike within the just third way, is recognizing that each human being, in order to be free and develop, has to have power. So that's the capacity or ability to do something, to act in a certain way, and to direct or influence others, and to effect change. Magic Johnson said years ago when there were riots, I think in Los Angeles, that the problem is that, and these are his words to paraphrase, we as Black people don't own anything, and therefore we have no power. So he was recognizing the importance of ownership in terms of each person having power. Property, as Norm brought up earlier, and we're using the definition from Law and Economics, is not the thing you own. It's not the land, it's not the robots, it's not the corporate shares, it's the powers and the right of control over the things you own. So I would actually switch the order of these. It's the most important. It's the right of control over what a person owns. That includes possessing, excluding others, disposing or transferring, using, destroying, or injuring. And we can talk more about that. But the other, which is very important in terms of the economy and bringing about balance between production and consumption, and bringing about harmony within society and general, really universal access to affluence. This other right is specifically the right to enjoy the fruits, profits, products, or increase from what one owns. So these two, and Kelso would say property is essentially the right of control, and it has to be respected by others and protected by law. Now one of the things that would come up is when you talk about destroying or injuring, you're talking about your rights with respect to what you own. But another important point that Kelso says is that you cannot use this right, property rights, to harm others or their property or their things. So we would say that property, we're going to look at it in two different ways. One is that every human being has an inalienable right to become an owner and have access to the same institutions, social institutions that would enable each person to become an owner, especially of productive things that produce an income. So that is the absolute right of access to become an owner. The other part is where laws come in, and that's where you may need to place limits on how you exercise your property rights. So those are the limited and socially determined bundle of rights that define, how you use those rights, what constitutes legitimate use. And this is built into one of the few sort of global statements on human rights, Article 17. If you go to the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it says everyone has the right to own property alone as well as in association with others. And the second part of that is no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his property. So when we talk about the just third way, occasionally what comes to their mind is, oh, this sounds like socialism. And as we will get into later classes, there's a very distinct differentiation when you talk about property and you talk about whether it should be universally accessible, only accessible to a few, special individuals, or accessible to no one. That private property really is eliminated, and the rights of control are put into a governing body, usually the state or whoever's running a collective. So the next point that is really will help you see when an economist or a policymaker starts talking about money, and even when ordinary people talk about money, we really have to understand how Kelso is talking about money. There's certain definitions, and Mike Graney can enumerate all of them, which we wouldn't disagree with, but they miss the key element about money and how you can transform a social and economic system if you understand money in the way that we do. So we're going to start with Kelso's definition of money, that it's a yardstick for measuring economic input, economic outtake, and the relative values of the real goods and services of the economic world. So the key thing here is that idea of a yardstick, of a way of measuring value of all transactions in the economy. So we're moving away from this notion of money specifically being this paper that you know, go to a store and you use it, or a check, or other forms of, or gold, whatever you consider the different types of money or forms of money. That's not the essence. The essence is that is way of measuring value. So we want to keep that in mind. And money is very much tied in inextricably, actually, to the idea of credit. Money and credit are, in a sense, two sides of the same coin. One is where you may not, credit is, in a sense, what you're going to use in order to acquire things, and you're going to repay a loan in the form of money. That's one way of describing this, but they all are based on the notion of trust, promises and trust. If you don't trust that your money is legitimate, you have no basis then for using it as a means of exchange. And credit also is the expectation that whoever you loan money to is going to repay that loan. And if you don't have trust about someone's credit worthiness or their ability to repay, you probably aren't going to make a loan. So we also want to see that money and credit, particularly in the just third way, they are not commodities. In other words, unlike today, we shouldn't be buying and selling money and credit and making profits on these things, which should just be yardsticks. So if we can move away from that notion of money and credit as a commodity, then we can start to see that the real issue is producing real goods and services. And we also look at, one of the standard definitions of money is that it is a medium of exchange. As Mike Graney will go into great depth on, the key here is that it is the medium of exchange. Anything that can be used to settle a debt, and that may be in the form of dollar bills, it may be in the form of promissory notes, it may be in many different forms, but the key thing is it's still just a symbol of value, way of measuring value. So it is, no matter what the form is, money in the just third way is the medium of exchange. And also, again, credit is a loan of money to be repaid. So we see the connection there. So if we're talking about transforming a system, we're talking about a new understanding of money, and also understanding new understanding of credit, and a focus on capital credit. Again, the moral basis of the just third way. Now I'm going to get into the components of the just third way. And this is where I mentioned earlier, one of the resources you can use just to remind yourself is the just third way on one hand, just third way paradigm. And you can find that on the website under, I think it's about or learn. It's in the learn section, and where you have definitions. So this is what we keep in mind when we're talking about any level of the just third way, including at the macro level, policies, or look at individual transactions. If this is violating the dignity of any person or creating barriers to empowerment of every person, then it's not legitimate under the just third way. We also want to look at the theory by which we understand balance and growth in the economy. And we can go back to Say's law of markets, and Mike also will go into this in more depth, what that really means. Most of us recognize it, the phrase that supply creates its own demand and demand creates its own supply. And I never understood that phrase at all. But what Kelso points out, and this is in his theory of binary economics, that in order to achieve balance between production and consumption, so you never have overproduction or over or under consumption or whatever imbalance, you have to make sure that each person has the means to produce both, either or both through their labor, their capital ownership, or both together, so that those inputs, if we understand that properly, the what goes into the production tells you what you're entitled to in terms of distribution. And it also says that as we produce new goods and services, we're also increasing income. You know, what didn't exist before that can be, you can use or you can exchange with someone else. So production equals income. And when you see that in it that way, then you can see, well, we better make sure that every person, and this includes someone born yet, today, how can an infant be productive? They certainly can't contribute their labor. So what is it they can contribute? And, not that they're going to be making decisions, but their property right, by their property right, they can contribute to production through the ownership of capital. And that produces the income that they are entitled to. So this is Kelso's understanding, or his concept of binary economics relates to Say's law. And another breakthrough that Kelso brought to the world, and this is important, it was not only this idea of economic justice that he developed with Mortimer Adler, it's really systematizing three principles, but it was in how we finance corporate growth, finance the production system, how we finance the creation of new goods and services. And it goes back to this notion of the golden rule. He who holds the gold makes the rules. So this is, in essence, how we look at today's system and how money is created, that if it channels new money and credit to the same people who already own, it's just going to make them richer. And if you don't enable other people, non-owners, to have access in a systematic business-like way, you're going to be leaving out the vast majority of human beings on this planet from being able to acquire capital in order to legitimately produce and gain an income from their capital. So here you see that we're talking about democratizing access to insured capital credit. That is the innovation that Kelso brings. And then how you repay it is with the future profits of the capital you've just acquired. So that breaks the necessity of someone already being rich or having capital or money to begin with. They can now be tied in as long as you have a feasible business project. That is the basis of new money and credit that is created. And Kelso and Mortimer Adler created, I would say, the first, I've never seen any other scholar do this, and that is to create a systems understanding of economic justice, meaning in a system, you always have inputs, and that you have the outtake, and then you always have a feedback mechanism if those things get out of balance. And so they're using, rather than what Father Ferry would call the individual level of justice, which is that if I give you something, you exchange something of equal value with me. So that's person to person. Now we're looking at the system as a whole, how you make contributions, how you get your just distribution, and how the system it corrects, and how do you change a system is very important. But this is not just at an individual level, it's how you ensure every person has this access to the institutions in these according to these principles. So we have participative justice, which, if anyone in this group can find the use of that term anywhere, please send it to us. because while the concept has been used, we've never seen that term used before, as a specific principle that says that each person in economics has the natural right to participate fully in the process of production so they can legitimately earn the income from the production, and that it has to take place, or you must have access to every form of input, which would be labor and capital, the ownership of your labor, ownership of your capital. And the distributive justice principle dictates how much each person is entitled to. So this is not distribution based on need, which is the principle for charity. This is the principle of justice. And then social justice, which we'll get into in future sessions, is really how the system is ordered, but what do you do when the system is defective and harming people? And that comes to the notion of organizing, the act of social justice. So that is the feedback and corrective principle. Then we also look at, in terms of putting these ideas into law, and Norm, and I think there may be some other lawyers in the group, they recognize that if this is not built into the law and you have no power to enforce these rights within law, then you basically don't have it. It's really a free-for-all. So we do look at the orderly process of creating laws, legitimate laws, and the proper use of institutions. But we're also starting with the notion that you do need a free market economy in order to even have the possibility of justice, because otherwise you will have a command and control economy where each person is not free to make their own economic choices. So we start with that, but we also, unlike some of the laissez-faire economists or schools of economics, we don't believe that just having a free market economy is sufficient to bring justice. So you really need to be looking at how you ensure that everyone has equal access to participate. So in those four pillars, and I realize I'm going into great detail here, but we start with the new thing, which is the expanded capital ownership, that you must have a broad distribution of capital ownership. And when we say broad, we're talking about that every human person has the means and access to become an owner of capital, that there are no barriers to that. We also believe that economic power, must start in the hands of each human person, and not the government, not the collective, not the corporation, et cetera, the labor union, et cetera. It starts with each human person. We also believe that private property, as we understand it, that bundle of rights and powers over the things that we own, that is essential. If we don't have it as our own private property, then someone else has it and they can exercise control over us. So that private property, as America's founders understood, is essential to freedom. And then again, in terms of economics and the production of goods and services and the legitimate distribution of the rewards, the free and open market system is essential for that, so that people have the freedom to make their choices and not be coerced. And it also requires that you have equal access to information about the things being exchanged, et cetera. So it's not, what is it, customer beware. No, there has to be a moral structure. And if you design your systems of money and tax systems and other systems, you won't need constant new regulations. So we're not trying to build just regulations for the sake of regulations. But as Mike, as an accountant, a CPA, will tell you, if you build up proper internal controls, you're not going to have thousands of regulations. And we also will look more in later sessions on how do you take these ideas of equal access to money power and make them practical in order to make the economy work and to produce goods and services. How do you For example, we know that energy systems are going to be essential. How do we ensure that the ownership of those systems is spread out in a democratic way and not concentrated? So we have these basic vehicles, and there can be many variations on them, but the maybe the most important in terms of change will be each person's capital ownership account. So that we also in St. Louis, where we had a law passed in Missouri that can establish the world's first citizens land development cooperative. So this deals with how do you plan and develop land and infrastructure. Already existing in the law is the employee stock ownership plan and consumer stock ownership plans. It's interesting, I guess in Europe, they're looking at Kelso's concepts of consumer stock ownership plans, but much of that could be covered, both the ESOP and the CSOP, though that those forms of ownership can actually be done through the capital ownership account. And I'm not going to go into this. We will go through the actual steps in how you finance growth in a green way, in a sustainable and environmentally sound way, used by through the enactment of the Economic Democracy Act. So you'll see, we'll go over the role of commercial and cooperative banks, and most importantly, the role of the central bank. And in the United States, it's the 12 regional Federal Reserves. And in St. Louis, we're looking at the St. Louis Federal Reserve and also the Kansas City Federal Reserve, which is they both, I guess they're both in Missouri. So those will be key. And then how we deal with the problem of having collateral. If you get a loan, the lender's going to know what happens if you can't pay the loan back. Well, what can I take? That's a collateral. And that is a barrier to ownership that Kelso was able to overcome with the concept of capital credit insurance. So we'll go into the technicalities and the process in greater detail. And as we believe the time is now, it's critical. And that's why each of you is so important in this movement, this change of systems. We need to have people who are knowledgeable and articulate, spreading this idea as quickly and to every person, but to also to leaders. We have to surface leaders, as Norma said. And we know that we have an idea that is powerful, and it's an idea whose time has come. Thank you.